George Harrison never yelled or got loud. He hardly ever got mad in interviews. Viewed inside the Beatles, he was quietly angry, and that anger got worse over time. It wasn't loud. It wasn't something everyone could see, but it was real. It was personal. Under his calm and peaceful way of acting was anger that never went away. The quiet one who felt left out in the early 1960s. George Harrison was just a teenager riding a school bus in Liverpool when he met Paul McCartney. They shared guitar chords, traded music records, and both loved skiffle and rock and roll music. McCartney was older, smarter, and more sure of himself. George was quiet and easy to influence. He liked Paul's confidence, and later, John Lennon's talent. When he joined Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, in 1958, he was only 15. Lennon first thought he was too young. McCartney had to set up a second tryout. On a bus where George impressed John by playing the guitar part from Raunchy. That memento panned the door to what would become famous band in history. But even from start, George Harrison was walking new to someone else's story. Lennon and McCartney controlled the band's early look and sound. They were the main songwriters. They made the plans. George followed. He watched and copied. And for a while, that was okay. As the Beatles became super famous, Harrison got the nickname the Quiet Beatle. Partly, it was then newspapers making his shy personality sound romantic. But to those who knew him well, it was something heavier, a man who was starting to feel pushed aside, even suffocated. He had musical ideas. He had spiritual awakenings. But in the recording studio, his voice was too often ignored. When he suggested songs, they were passed over. When he offered guitar arrangements, they were questioned. Paul, especially, who always wanted things perfect, had a way of taking over. George would later say, "He ruined me as a guitar player." Not because Paul was mean, but from years off being quietly put down. The Lennon-McCartney partnership wasn't just in charge, it was like a kingdom inside a band. George wasn't just left out, he was left behind. And as the group changed, the frustration inside him began to get harder. What had started as looking up to them slowly turned into anger. And no one mad at that fire burned more than Paul McCartney. The moment everything broke in the studio. By the time the Beatles started working on the White Album in 1968, George Harrison was no longer happy with being the silent helper. He had grown as a songwriter, both in confidence and dreams. But inside the studio, things were getting more and more tense. The way they worked together had changed. Paul McCartney, driven and obsessed with details, had taken on a leader role without anyone officially making him the leader. John Lennon, often distracted by his new relationship with Yoko Ono, was acting more strange. And George, he was done being overlooked. The recording sessions for Let It Be in nearly 1969 showed the cracks that had been building for years. Cameras rolled as the band tried to practice, but what they caught was less working together and Maraquiat falling apart. One famous moment between George and Paul was caught on tape. Paul was trying to tell Harrison how to play his guitar part on the song 2 of U.S. Frustrated, George pushed back with a calm but sharp line. "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at a leaf. That's what you want." It was sarcasm. It was giving up a quiet way of saying, "I'm not here to fight you, beauty. I'm tired of this." Two people watching from outside, it may have seemed like a small argument. But to those in the room, it was the result of years of not being able to express his art. Engineer Glyn Johns, who saw the Let It Be sessions firsthand, later said the atmosphere was very unpleasant. The creative process had become a battlefield. And George, no longer willing to hide his frustration, temporarily quit the band on January 10, 1969. What made it worse was that Paul didn't seem to understand how serious what he was doing was. He wasn't mean, just controlling. McCartney had a vision, and he wanted everyone to follow it, even if it meant running over their ideas. George had finally reached his limit. After coming back to the band a few days later under new agreements, he began working on songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun. Masterpieces that proved what he could do. He was simply left alone. But the damage wasn't fixed. The split between George and Paul had grown into something more permanent. And while George may have returned to the band, a part of him had already moved on. When friendship turned cold, the Beatles officially broke up in 1970. But for George Harisson, the split wasn't just about work. It was deeply personal, while the newspapers focused on the fight between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Harisson was quietly cutting his own emotional ties, especially with Paul. The public saw polite interviews and stage reunions, but behind the scenes, George was struggling to let go of the anger that had been building for years. In 1971, Harisson released All Things Must Pass, a solo album filled with songs that had been rejected or pushed as a D during his time with the Beatles. It was a creative and commercial success, and it didn't go unnoticed by his former bandmates. One track in particular, Wah Wah, stood out. On the surface, it sounded a beat, but the words were biting. The title was a metaphor for the emotional noise and frustration George endured. And Monty understood the song as a thinly hidden jab at Paul McCartney's bossy behavior. They're in their final years as a group. The bitterness didn't stop there. In 1973, Harisson released Sue Me Sue You Blues, another pointed commentary, this time a booth legal battles that followed their breakup. While the song addressed the group as a whole, it was clear that much of his frustration was aimed at McCartney, who had started the lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles' business partnership. That move, while accessory, felt like betrayal to Harisson, not just because of the court drama, but because it cemented how far apart they had grown. Even Harrison's ex-wife, Patty Boyd, later said that George never truly liked Paul's personality. She described how George would come home from recording sessions filled with anger, overwhelmed by the constant arguments, especially with Paul. They tolerated each other, she said, but I don't think they really loved each other. Professionally, they made brief attempts to work together again. In 1994, the surviving Beatles reunited fourth anthology project, but even then, old bits came back. George still found Paul difficult. In private, he would roll high sighs at McCartney's suggestions. And Paul, ever the diplomat in public, admitted they still got on each other's nerves. Time had passed, but the wounds hadn't really healed. A guitar silenced. By the mid-1970s, George Harisson had already carved out a successful solo career. But the scars from his Beatles years still lingered, especially when it came to Paul McCartney. In a 1975 radio interview with Alan Freeman, George spoke honestly about something few had heard him admit out loud. I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player. Having spent so many years with Paul, he ruined me as a guitar player. It was a devastating statement, quiet but sharp, coming from a man respected for his guitar work on songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The comment showed how psychologically damaged those years under McCartney's influence had been. George wasn't saying Paul hadn't it on purpose. What he meant was that the years of being overshadowed, second-guessed, and micromanaged had drained him of creative confidence. He'd spent too much time playing what someone else wanted, and too little time being heard on his own terms. This internal conflict didn't just affect his playing, it affected how he viewed working with others. In the same period, George confessed he would gladly join a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. Paul is a fine bass player, he said, but he's a bit overpowering at times. That wasn't an insult. It was their reality of working with someone whose need for perfection often meant control. For Harisson, the issue wasn't just music. It was about space, about being allowed to grow. And inside the Beatles, there had been very little space left for him. That realization, painful and quiet, followed dim long after the applause had faded. Lennon, the wound that never closed. While George Harrison's frustrations with Paul McCartney were more visible, his relationship with John Lennon was arguably more complicated and in many ways more painful. In the early years of the Beatles, Harisson looked up to Lennon. John was older, sharp-witted, and fearless. George saw him not just as a bandmate, but as a techer. Lennon, alongside McCartney, had helped shape Harrison's early songwriting, even encouraging him to experiment with structure and lyrics. That sense of closeness, however, began to fall apart as the years passed. As Lennon became increasingly absorbed in his personal life, particularly his relationship with Yoko Ono, George found himself emotionally shut out. John, who once took pride in his bond with George, grew distant. And unlike McCartney's dominating studio presence, Lennon's not caring cut in a different way. He made fun of Harrison's growing interest in Indian music and spirituality, accreting it with sarcasm rather than curiosity. He thought George had turned to meditation and Hindu philosophy as a way to find peace and identity. But from Lennon, he received a little more than eye rolls. The true depth of their separation became visible in George's 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine. In over 400 pages of personal reflection, George barely mentioned Lennon at all. Fans noticed, and it wasn't an accident. The silence was a message in itself. Harisson later admitted that John could have been a very difficult person and that their final years together were often cold. When Lennon was murdered in December 1980, the shock rattled George to his core. But even then, his tribute was not full of nostalgia or sentimentality. Instead, Harisson expressed his grief through music all those years ago, a song that was both tribute and subtle reckoning. It remembers early bond, yes, but it didn't pretend the pain had never happened. In latter interviews, Harisson spoke more softly about Lennon. Age and distance had allowed him to reflect. He acknowledged John's genius and their complicated history, but the emotional scar never really faded. For Harisson, Lennon was someone he had once followed blindly and someone who had later made him feel invisible. That kind of wound doesn't heal easily, even with time. The final years, the final words. As the 1990s came to a close, George Harisson had largely stepped out of the Beatles' shadow, at least in public. He was no longer the young guitarist fighting for space on an album. By then, he had become a respected solo artist, a quiet philanthropist, and a spiritual thinker. Yet, despite his peaceful exterior, the emotional leftover feelings from his years with the Beatles still lingered. Harisson rarely talked about the band unless someone asked. When did, his tone was dry, thoughtful, and often tinged with irony. He didn't make it past sound romantic. He told the truth, or at least his version of it. In one interview, when asked if he missed being in the Beatles, he replied, "Not with the others, no." That remark, while funny on surface, revealed just how deep Thewins went. In 1994, George reunited with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr for the Beatles anthology project. It was a media sensation. For the first time since their split, the surviving members were back in the same room, working on music together, completing John Lennon's unfinished demos, Free as a Bird and Real Love. To fans, it was a moment of healing, but insiders saw a different story. Old dynamics quickly returned. George bristled under Paul's direction. When asked in an interview how it felt to be back in the studio with McCartney, Harisson replied, "It was like going back to school." Producer Jeff Lynne, who had worked with George in the Traveling Wilbury and helped produce the anthology recordings, later recalled how George rolled his eyes whenever Paul got too controlling. McCartney, to his credit, later admitted that the old patterns never really disappeared. We got on each other's nerves, but we got through it. By 1997, Harisson was diagnosed with throat cancer. He received radiation treatment and briefly went into remission. But the decessor turned, this time in his lungs and brain. During these final years, he lived mostly out of the public eye, spending time with his wife Olivia and son Donnie at their home in Friar Park, a sprawling Victorianist in Henley-on-Thames. Even in the throes of illness, George's wit remained intact. In a 2001 Yahoo online chat, on of his last public appearances, he was asked, "Does Paul still annoy you?" George didn't answer directly. Instead, he quoted an old Victorian proverb, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." It was vintage Harisson, philosophical, elegant, but unmistakably pointed. As his condition worsened, Harisson was visited by old friends. One of them was Paul McCartney. The meeting was quiet and personal. Paul later described how they sat together holding hands, a gesture another would have made in their younger years. "He was my baby brother," Paul said in a 2008 interview. "We joked. We talked about silly things. It was like we were dreaming." George Harisson died on November 29, 2001 at a friend's home in Los Angeles, surrounded by his loved ones. His final words, according to Olivia, were simple: love one another. But even in death, the complications of his relationships remained. While Paul grieved publicly and spoke warmly of George in interviews, the unspoken tension between them had never fully dissolved. The forgiveness, if it came, was quiet, incomplete, and perhaps one-sided. George Harisson left behind a legacy of music, spiritual searching, and quiet rebellion. He had never been the loudest Beatle. Booth's pain was real, and his silence spoke volumes. Through the decades, there had been admiration, there had been love. But there had also been bitterness. And in the end, there were some people George Harisson simply could never fully forgive.